Okay, hi everyone. This is Dr. Young, your RMOP, um, providing a kind of a virtual brown bag on coping with change in the age of COVID-19. A couple of management announcements. The first is that I sound a little stuffy, and it doesn't mean that I'm sick. Um, it means that I'm quarantined right now in a house with my daughter's dog that I'm allergic to. So I'm a little allergic, but I don't have a fever. The second thing, housekeeping note, I would say is no matter how I light this thing or focus it, I seem to look about 100 years older than I look in real life. So I apologize for that. Try to remember the more youthful version that you've seen in person. This is, not the best doing it this way because we can't do questions. I'm hoping that we can do a live town hall style virtual meeting. Part of the problem is that right now I'm unable to get into Med and to get into those tools, so I'm sort of on my own here. Along with this video, you also received a slide deck, and so I'm going to talk through the slides, but also if you don't have the slides, that's okay too, because I'm going to try and talk, give the talk as if you couldn't see the slides. So the first slide says coping with change in the age of COVID-19, and the second slide is goals for today. What are we going to talk about? Well, the first thing we're going to talk about is that change is inevitable. It can be difficult, but it's part of the human experience. We're going to talk about why this particular change is different and more difficult for us. We're going to talk through one model about changes that go through in life and sort of how to think about them. And we're going to talk about some ideas to make change less painful. So kind of a lot to do. Next slide. So the next slide says change, the facts. What do we know about change? Well, first of all, we know it's inevitable. No matter who we are, every day brings some new thing into our lives. The problem, though, is that as human beings, we like things to stay the same. And think about your own life. You get up about the same time most days. You have what you have for breakfast. You have your commute to work, even though we're supposed to vary it. Most of us don't, because we like things to stay the same. We know what we like, and we like things to be predictable. So we resist it. So change is often difficult because we have that resistance, that tendency to resist it. And often change has things about it that we can't predict. Things that we think are going to be difficult changes sometimes have a silver lining. Things that we think are positive changes sometimes don't. So I think it's that uncertainty that makes change especially hard for humans. Next slide. So the first thing to note is that some period of feeling out of sorts or emotional or depressed is normal. The feelings are abnormal. The feelings are not abnormal. The situation is. So a lot of times people will come to me and say, do I have a depressive disorder? Do I have an anxiety disorder? And in fact, they don't. The brain does certain things when faced with difficult situations, and we're going to talk about what it does. The problem is that the brain's way of trying to cope often isn't so good for us and makes us feel not so great. Next slide. The problem is, as humans, as you all know, is that we have the ability to say what if. We have the ability to worry, to think about what bad things might come next. And that separates us from all the other organisms. We have that ability. And of course, it's a great gift because it allows us to plan and think and educate. But it's also a curse because we always have that sense of, what difficult thing could be around the corner. Next slide. So the first thing we want to know when faced with a big change, let's just start there. We won't talk about the COVID-19 yet. Let's just talk about big changes. The first thing we want to know is what happened. And that's what the slide says, what happened. And why is that? Because we want to know information. The first thing our brain wants to do is to figure out what it's dealing with. Next slide. Because information is important. So we want to know as much detail as possible. It gives us a stage, a context to try to make sense of this thing. It gives us a chance to begin some processes that sometimes aren't so good, which we're going to talk about, guilt and blame. It causes problems because rumors develop. When people don't have information, we fill in the blanks. And that's why, when I talk to leadership at Post, I always talk about making sure people are as informed as we can make them. Because if we don't inform them, then we have problems. And even if the answer is we don't know yet, people are much more comfortable with that than they are with we know but we're not going to tell you. That's never a good answer. Because the issue isn't so much what the story is, it's the fact that we need the story. We need some kind of a narrative to make sense of this event that's happened to us. Next slide. So after we get some details about what happened, what's the next thing we want to know? We want to know why. We want to know the reasons. Next slide. Because we want something to make sense of this event. Understanding why helps us put it together. It helps us to avert a future problem like this. If we know why, we can do something about that why. But again, the problem also leads to this issue of denial and blame and guilt, the things that we do when we're faced with something that we don't really have a lot of control over. So let's talk about these two sides of this bad coin, guilt and blame. So guilt is the part that when you say, if I only had, fill in the blank. This seems like it's preventable. If I had been more careful, if I had chosen this lifestyle to live overseas, maybe I wouldn't be in this situation I'm in right now. If I was a better person, if I was a smarter person. This is unfortunately, even in situations that we have no control over, this is a risk because we want life to be predictable. We want there to be an explanation. So even if the explanation makes us really sad, feel guilty, it doesn't mean we don't think that way. And so sometimes we have to push back on that. It's a natural sense. And what's guilt's twin brother? Blame. Next slide. And blame is the idea that somebody must have made this happen. I always tell the story about when I covered Haiti after the big earthquake a few years ago, and I went to Haiti several times in the 2 years after the earthquake, and almost every single time someone had to bring up the ambassador walking his dog during the earthquake. Well, the real story was the ambassador lived in his office for 3 months. And I would say to people, how would it have helped you to have the ambassador's dog, pee in his office? And of course there was no answer, but it was this idea that his unfeeling, his callousness made people suffer more, even though that wasn't true. And this is a very, strong emotion for people who face difficult times. They want someone to blame. Someone must be responsible for this. Because the idea that just sort of random things happen is very hard for humans to accept. We want the world to be predictable. And so when very random things happen, that kind of smashes that idea that the world's predictable, and it makes us very uncomfortable. So if we come back and say, well, it must be my fault, or it must be your fault, that kind of makes sense of it, even though that leads to a lot of really negative feelings, both for individuals and for groups. So next slide. So let's talk about this COVID situation. So one of the acronyms that I saw that I liked is they said Covid-19 is nuts. What does that mean? Well, there's 4 pieces of a stressor that can make it more difficult to manage. N is novelty, so it's something new that we haven't seen before. U is unpredictable, so we can't put it into a context. T is a threat. It's something that could hurt us or hurt our families. And S is a low sense of control. So novelty, unpredictability, threatening, and unable to control it. And the pandemic virus, of course, hits all 4 of those, doesn't it? It's new. 2 months ago, we never even heard of this thing. It's unpredictable. Every day we read the paper and wonder what's next. It's threatening and scary to a lot of us, most of us, all of us. And we don't have any control over it. It's this thing that just sort of emerged in the world. I imagine most of us have learned more about virology in the last 2 months than we ever had previously in our lives. Next slide. So it's that uncertainty, it's the unpredictability that's the hardest part. We like situations that are predictable. And what happens in a situation that can't be predicted, it creates this sort of post-traumatic kind of cycle where your brain just sort of spins and thinks about it over and over and tries to figure it out. The problem is that we can't shut that off that easily. There's a lot of things in the brain that we just don't have that much control over. If I said to you, hey, raise your temperature by 5 degrees right now, you couldn't do it, right? If I said, hey, secrete some insulin, go. You couldn't do it, could you? And unfortunately, anxiety sort of lives behind that same wall. And so your brain says, I must figure this out. I must understand this. And so it cycles it over and over. And unfortunately, for some things in life, there's no answer. And so that can be very anxiety-provoking, that sort of process of thinking and rethinking over and over. Sometimes the best way across the river is one stone at a time. In other words, if you look at the opposite shore, if you think too much about how am I going to get there, you could be frozen on the river and unable to move. You're paralyzed. But if you take it one stone at a time, sort of focus on today, what's in front of you right now, eventually you're going to get there. But this situation is definitely one of those that makes us think about, oh my God, what could happen? But the reality is none of us know what's going to happen. We don't know what the other side of the river is going to look like, and we don't know how long it's going to take to get there. So the only thing we can really control is the next step. So try to keep that in mind. And it's hard because we want to balance our need to be informed. We have to read those 200 new cables a day, but we also have to try to live the rest of our lives too. So that's what's hard, very hard about this. What are some of the common fears that people have? Well, some of them you'd expect, some of them are kind of surprising. Of course, the biggest fear, right, is I'm going to get sick, or I'm going to die, or someone I love is going to get sick. But people are also afraid to go to the hospital. They're afraid to get infected there. They're afraid they're not sick enough. They don't know what to do. People are afraid of losing their jobs. A lot of people have already. People are afraid of the disruption, being quarantined, what I'm doing right now, having their travel plans canceled. One really tough thing here in Washington is they've canceled all the graduations, all these colleges. So this is a time of year when, many thousands of families will be coming here to celebrate graduations, and they've all been canceled. So very disruptive, which all leads to a sense of powerlessness, which is the thing we fear probably the most. We overinterpret symptoms. Who hasn't said, am I breathing a little too hard? Maybe I should take my temperature. Do I have a fever? Was that a cough? So we're overinterpreting. And then we're also afraid of, and we're participating in stigmatization, what nationality caused this? It must be their fault. Next slide. What are some common rumors? Well, one rumor is the virus only attacks old people and spares young children. Yeah, that's kind of true. But there's a significant percentage also of people in their 20 to 50 who are sick. The virus can be transmitted from pets, so pets should be abandoned. Not true. Using mouthwash, antibiotics, cigarettes, or liquor can kill the virus. Not that we know of, unless you wash your hands with the liquor. That Covid-19 is a bioweapon designed to target a population. One rumor I heard was that it had sort of escaped from a lab. Food items are contaminated. Not true. Or only a specific ethnic group can spread the virus. Not true. It's out there now. Any of us can spread it. So the next slide is a drop of water falling into a pond. It's a picture you've all seen before with the rings that go around the drop. And I think I include this slide because when we think about a big trauma like this, it's I think helpful sometimes to think about the layers of people who are impacted. So the drop of water itself is the people who get sick, right? That's the impact. But then the next ring is their family members and the people who love them. The next ring is people who have to take care of them. The next ring is people who didn't get sick but feel badly that they did, which sounds silly, right? But people do feel like that. They have survivor guilt, and they feel bad when other people get sick, or other people are in the earthquake, or other people are in the hurricane, and they avoid it, and they can feel very guilty. The next ring is people in the community who have been traumatized before, who are more vulnerable to psychological symptoms. The next ring are people in the community who have mental illness, who have depression or anxiety or OCD already. Imagine if you had OCD and now you had to wash your hands for real. So my point is to sort of help you to see that there's sort of a lot of stratification of people who are affected by something like this, and they're all affected sort of in different ways, in unique ways. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about this model of change. This is a model by a guy named William Bridges. And basically what he said is that, is that we're always on this sort of circle where something's ending, something's starting, and something's in the middle. And I think it's a really nice way to think about change because we're all dealing with change all the time. Big things like a new baby or a marriage, and little things like a job promotion or starting a new school year. But we're all in this sort of process of something ending and something beginning. And I think it's good to think about that because this stress that we're dealing with now kind of fits in that model, right? And we're sort of in the middle, which we'll talk about in a minute. So when you think about change in this model, there's a difference between change and transition. The change is the thing. The change is the broken leg. The change is the car accident. And that usually happens fast. It's the transition. It's that internal psychological adjustment that takes time, where we feel excited or anxious or uncertain. So the official new start is when the event happens. The psychological adjustment can lag way behind. I have a quote on this slide that says, "My soul was jet-lagged and took 3 months to catch up." And I really like that because it describes what it's like sometimes to have a change in your life and really feel kind of disoriented, and even happy things, and think to yourself, I should be happier. Why aren't I? And sometimes it's because this gap between the actual event and then your adjustment to it. Next slide. So the next slide is a graph, and it's a very simple graph though. And really all it shows is that, when we're ending something, we're already starting. There's already a little piece that's the new beginning. And when we've entered the new beginning and we're adjusted to the change, there's still a part of us that's saying goodbye. And so it's this sort of constant cycle of going through, letting go, joining the next thing, and that middle phase in between. Next slide. So the next slide shows just a picture of a girl, sad, with a dartboard with a picture of her and her boyfriend on it. I guess we're guessing that they've broken up. And that's the ending. So the next slide says endings. First of all, any beginning involves the ending of something else. And even happy things. So a couple has a new baby, so that's super happy, right? Everyone's happy. But it's also the ending of something too, right? It's the ending of that period of their lives when it was just them, which many couples look back on very fondly. So even though the arrival of that first baby is a wonderful, magical moment, it's also the end, right, of something else. And so sometimes new parents or new moms will feel that. And she's, we should be so happy. I'm like, well, you are happy, but there's a part of you that's sad too. And that's this whole model of change, that it's always sort of cycling. So even if the change is welcome, there can still be a sense of loss, because goodbyes are hard. Next slide. It says endings, 2 questions. What are the 2 questions when we face something ending? Well, the first, again, allergies. The first is, what is it time to let go in my own life right now? What's holding me back? The other is, what's waiting in the wings of my life, waiting to make its entrance? And so sometimes if you feel stuck, you can think about that. What's holding you back and what might help you to move forward? So the next slide shows 2 people on a trapeze with 1 person in between, and that's the middle phase. Next slide. Or the neutral zone, which is kind of where we are now with the Covid-19 thing. We're between trapezes. And this is a hard place to be. It's a no man's land. People often describe feeling confused or lost, sort of feeling sad or depressed. It can be a difficult time, and it is, right, for all of us, because we've sort of left what life was like before, but we don't know what life's going to be like on the other side yet. And that's the between trapezes. But there's one upside, and that is that during this time is when people often ask themselves, what am I doing with my life? You don't ask yourself that on a regular day, right? Going through your day, just have your coffee. Hey, what am I doing with my life? You don't do that. But when their crisis comes, you do. You kind of sit down with yourself and think, hey, what am I doing? What am I really doing with my life? And that's sort of the upside of this neutral zone between trapezes. And think about it right now. The world's kind of doing that. The world's thinking about, how do we communicate? How do we work? Maybe we could do it differently. But it took this crisis to force that. And so that's sort of the upside. I know, it's not much of an upside. Next slide. How do we help each other through the neutral zone? Well, the first thing is we have to be patient with ourselves, okay? And expect that we're going to be uncomfortable. You're going to be anxious. You're going to feel self-conscious. You're going to feel like you can't do a very good job. I feel that way right now doing this. I've done many talks, but I've never recorded one before. So it's different. Will this be what we do in the future? I don't know. But I think all of us are sort of caught in that right now. The key is, don't get caught up in bitching, moaning, and whining. BMW. A little of that, sure, but too much of that, and we get depressed and we can't function. So acceptance is really important. Acceptance in other people, acceptance in ourselves, patience with ourselves. A lot of people are talking about feeling more irritable right now, and that's really normal and natural. But that irritability is, I don't know what to do. And I'm getting frustrated that other people don't know what to do. Or I think I know what they should do and they're not doing it. One thing I talk about with people in the neutral zone too is try to hang on to the things in your life that haven't changed. Even in a situation like this, there's some things in your life that haven't changed. Your family hasn't changed. Some of the things you like to do haven't changed. And try to hang on to those. We're going to talk about kids in a little bit and kids and predictability and routines, but it's important for grown-ups too. So the next slide just shows an open door. The slide after that says new beginnings. So that's the third part of a change. The new beginning, it's here. One thing to think about with the new beginning is what we call the beginner's mind. And what does that mean? It means, and everybody's been on both sides of this dynamic. The new person comes in, they've been in the office for 2 weeks, and they say, hey, why do we do things like this? And everybody who's been there says, who are you? You don't know anything. But oftentimes that beginner's mind does know something. It sees something different that those of us who have been there don't know. And you've all been there. You've been the new guy and you've been the old guy. But the new beginning encourages that. And that's one reason I think, they move us around so much, because new eyes, new ideas sometimes help solve problems. But it's also hard because there's what we call flickering mind, which some days you feel great, feel really competent. Other days you feel like there's no way I can do this. And I think a lot of us feel that way right now because we're being faced with new situations and tasks that we didn't expect or anticipate. And when it goes well, we're psyched, we're happy. But when it doesn't go well, we feel incompetent. So being patient with yourself through all three phases is really important. Okay, the next slide shows a little Greek church in a snow globe. And what that's about is the additional stress of embassy life on top of everything else. In this crisis, it's a very public crisis. So it creates increased feelings of people not wanting to be seen as weak or not a team player. We all want to help, but some of us can't help. We don't have the equipment, we're not in the right place, we have a family member we have to deal with, and so that makes it hard. We have a sense that other people in the embassy have already got it figured out and we don't. We have anxiety that no one's telling us anything. We feel guilty about the decision to serve overseas in the first place. Why did we even do this? And then, of course, what if I get sick? What if my kids do? Is the health unit enough? Will the local government support us if their people are sick? So lots of additional stressors just because of this lifestyle that we live in. So what to do? So the next slide says that, what to do. Well, the first thing is, it's going to sound silly, but it's make a plan and write it down. Well, what does that mean? It sounds very, Pollyanna. But sometimes, at least for me anyway, writing things down helps me to organize my thoughts. And the plan may be something as simple as, how am I going to get food this week? Or the plan may be as complicated as, how am I going to manage a departure from post? Or the plan may be, how am I going to try and be helpful but also save some time for myself so I can balance myself. But writing it down can help. The second thing is spread calm. And I know that's hard when you don't feel calm. But the reality is, when I arrive at a scene where there's a crisis, or a fireman arrives, or a policeman arrives, it's really important in my own head to keep my cool. Because people are looking at me, and they think if I'm freaked out, they're going to get freaked out. This is really important with kids, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But one thing you can do for everybody and for yourself is to try to focus on spreading calm. Because when people are anxious and upset, they're not going to be as functional. You know it. Make an effort to recognize what you can't control. All right? Hypervigilance, it's exhausting. Try not to see every person as a sick person, which is hard because with the precautions we're doing now, we kind of do see everyone as a sick person, right? So, but at the same time, if you get so caught up in that what we call catastrophizing, did I say that right? Catastropheizing, it can be paralyzing. So there's only so much control you have. You can certainly control how far away you are from people and where you go and what you do, but you can't control the spread of this virus. You can only control you. So try to keep in mind what you can control versus what you can't. Take the long view. When they looked at people after Hurricane Katrina, one thing they noticed was that older people seemed to do better than some of the younger people. And the thinking was that older people had been through a hurricane before. So even as terrible as Hurricane Katrina was, they knew that there's another side to the mountain, that people recover from hurricanes eventually because they'd been through it. So try to take the long view. It's very hard right now not to get caught up in all the trauma of the day, right? But we are going to get to the other side of this thing one way or the other. There's going to be life in a world after this. We don't know what that's going to look like, but it can be reassuring to think that. And again, focus on the things in your life that haven't changed. There's things you like to do that you can still do. The problem is you don't feel like doing it. You say, oh, I'm on quarantine. I'm going to practice guitar every day. But then you don't feel like it. It's like little kids when you come up with 10 different things to do. I don't want it. That's boring. But you got to force yourself a little bit. Because part of the reason you don't want to do it is because you're anxious. You want to just sit there and be anxious and watch the news. But try to focus on some of the stuff, the other things in your life that are still there. The next slide just has a quote on it, and it says, accept that there are going to be questions that don't have answers. Make peace with the information you have and try to move on from there. And that's hard to do, because think of the first few slides, right? Humans like things predictable. We want to know who's to blame. But sometimes situations are unpredictable and there's no one to blame. And that's a really hard thing to kind of come to grips with. But it's where we are now. So thinking about that can help. Next slide. Next slide says transitions. What helps you? Well, the first thing, and I guess you're probably hearing the point here as I go through the talk, recognize that change inevitably leads to a period of disorientation and confusion and uncertainty, especially if it's imposed by someone else. So be patient with yourself. Use your support systems. Talking to other people for support, empathy can be helpful. Spend time with others virtually if you can. Obviously, that's kind of being taken away from us, and I think that's one reason this is so hard. It's so isolating because people need people and want to be around people and commiserate and trade stories. But we can sort of do some of that virtually, just like we're doing right now. So let's try to do that. Engage in some positive activities that work for you, whether it's sports, whether it's hobbies, whether it's reading. No matter what's happening in one area of your life, the rest of your life goes on. Use self-relaxation methods, the deep breathing. Breathe through your nose, blow up your stomach like a balloon, and put it out through your mouth. Do it 10 times. Why does everyone always say that? Why is breathing always involved in all these things? Well, remember earlier in the talk when I said you can't control a lot of stuff in your brain, right? You can't lower your blood pressure. Otherwise, $1 million medication industry would go out of business. You can't slow your heart rate. You can't speed it up. The one involuntary process you can change is your breathing. And that's why breathing's always part of these things. And because you can hold your breath or breathe fast or breathe slow. And controlling your breathing helps to control these other things that you can't control. It helps to slow down your heart rate. It helps to bring down your blood pressure. It helps to decrease your anxiety. That's why it's the key to the door that gets around this wall. Okay? So that's a very easy thing you can do, those 10 deep cleansing breaths. And you start doing, you sort of feel silly, but it helps. It works. So try to do those things. The next slide is a cartoon, and it just has a guy under a table that says, James decided to stay in that night. And again, typically we say, don't do this, right? Get outside, get out, engage, but we can't right now. On the other hand, I don't think lying under the table is really the answer either. We've talked about some things you can do even in your quarantine or in your social distancing that can still keep you connected to other people. The next slide is a cartoon of two guys pointing at each other. And that's the blame game, right? And that's the thing we want to avoid. And it's very easy to blame whole cultures. I mean, we've all heard President Trump call it the Chinese virus. But it's easy to blame other people at work too, right? This would be easier if so-and-so was here, if so-and-so was doing their work, if so-and-so was smarter. And the other side, of course, is guilt. Those of us who aren't there, I feel guilty being here and not there and not being able to do these things, in person. But I can't get all of you in a room. That's not allowed either. So it's new stuff across multiple fronts. The next slide says, what doesn't help you? Well, the first thing is using alcohol or drugs to cope. Well, What's the embassy solution to every crisis? Happy hour. We can't do that. It's probably a good thing. Although we've already seen people online doing virtual happy hours, right? I don't know if you've seen that, but I have. And, doing a virtual happy hour and having a drink with a friend or 10 friends is probably not a bad thing. Having 10 drinks probably is not a good thing. Working too much. It's another thing all of us do, right? Partly because there's lots of work to do. Partly because it gives us a sense of control and predictability. Partly because we don't know what else to do. But in the end, what do we end up? We end up exhausted and burned out. So you got to balance the work with some time away from it. Sometimes people go the other way, extreme avoidance of thinking or talking about it. I have people who say, I don't watch the news. I don't want to know. I mean, I guess that's a strategy. But again, we have to balance, right? That ability to get information, but also to live our lives. People get angry or get violent. A lot of us in the mental health community are really worried about domestic violence the longer this thing goes on, because people get frustrated and angry and they take it out on other people. And usually it's the people you love that you're the worst to, because they'll let you. People who aren't taking care of themselves, overeating or not eating, or playing a video game for 13 hours instead of 2 hours. And then again, the blaming ourselves or blaming others, the blame and the guilt. All of those things don't help. Next slide says, but don't keep quiet because you don't want to upset others. People want to listen. People do want to talk. Don't assume other people don't want to listen. You'd be surprised. Don't keep quiet because you're afraid you're going to be a burden. Everybody feels that way. Don't wait until you're so stressed or exhausted that you can't even benefit from the help. Because then we have to figure out a way to medevac you or something. So if you go too far down the line and you're so exhausted and you're so tired and you're so overwhelmed, then it's really hard for us to figure out a way to help you out. Next slide says, what about kids? It's kind of a busy slide, but I'm going to kind of walk through it. The first thing we want to do with kids, the most important thing is that kids, especially little kids, take their cue about how to deal with a problem situation from their parents. So if you're freaking out, they're going to freak out. Now, does that mean you should pretend to be happy? No. But you can control your overt emotion around little kids, and you can reassure them that things are going to be okay. Sometimes I give this talk and people say, so should we lie to our kids? I don't know if it's lying. I think it's more messaging to them at a level that they can integrate and understand. And that goes for information as well as emotion. Little kids don't know what to do when their parents start crying. They know what happens when they cry. You comfort them, but they don't really know what to do when you're really upset. So try to encourage them. If they want to talk about what's going on, I think you can talk to them. You can answer their questions. Again, if you say, we're not talking about this, that's going to raise their anxiety. I would just say you have to answer at the level they can understand. Telling them that it's okay and it's normal to feel upset or afraid, I think that's okay. And again, with the message that, but we're going to get through this, we're going to get better soon. Be understanding, because they regress just like we do. So little kids who are walking go back to crawling. Little kids who are toilet trained start having accidents. Little kids who talk well start doing baby talk. And that's just their way of coping. All those things will come back. But that's your cue that they're feeling stressed and overwhelmed when you start seeing those regressive behaviors, clingy behaviors. I want to be a baby again. Children look to their parents to feel safe and how to respond. The other thing is, try to think about your routines. You may not be able to do all of them, but kids like routines, just like we do, right? Predictability. And so if you read to them every night, keep reading to them every night. If you go to McDonald's every Friday, maybe you can't go to McDonald's, but try to make hamburgers at home. But try to reassure them that, we're going to keep doing some of the things that we do. I had a really clever mom once. I was talking about this in Africa, and apparently her family had a tradition at the first snowstorm. They lived in Vermont, I think. They would make cinnamon rolls. Well, at some point, the kids figured out there was no snow coming and said to their mom, well, when are we going to make cinnamon rolls? And the mom said, we'll make them at the first sandstorm. So I really liked that, because the message to the kids was that even though life is different, life goes on and our routines will continue. So think about that if you have kids. and are the things that they can do to reassure them that, these are the things we've always done and we're going to continue to do them. Getting kids out of their schedule, as you all know, those of you who have little kids who have grandparents visit, know how disrupted they can get when their schedules are disrupted. The next slide says, what about our community? What about all of us together in this? So the next slide says Group Process 101. And what this is about is that communities and groups act in predictable ways. And understanding that can help cope. It's not to do with intelligence. It doesn't matter the intelligence of the individual members of the group. You get a group of people together and certain things are going to happen, especially if they're stressed. And so what forms is what we call the mind of the crowd. And the mind of the crowd is usually angry. It usually wants justice. It usually wants an action right now. Any of you have been to a town hall when there's a stressor, probably have felt that pull of the crowd when people are standing up and yelling or shaking their fist or saying, I want to know what's going on with this. And that group process can really, really impede us, right? It can cause a lot of problems. The crowd fosters rumors. The crowd fosters contagion, which means once one person gets anxious in the crowd, everyone starts to get anxious. And of course, in this age of the internet, it's the perfect crowd, right? You can form a crowd really quickly on the internet and get a bunch of people who are angry and anxious and passing rumors back and forth. So try to be aware of that and not get pulled into the mind of the crowd. The next slide shows two different kind of groups, and one is a beehive, which is a group, right? A group of bees, but totally functional. Everybody's got a job. Everyone's doing their job. And my other picture is a bunch of people storming the castle with knives and guns, and they're a crowd. And the crowd isn't really doing anything effective. They're not even going to storm the castle that effectively because they're too angry to talk to each other, to work together. It's all about the mind of the crowd. So be the bees. The next slide is a picture of a guy who came up with this. His name was Gustave Le Bon, and he wrote this book back in the 1800s called The Mind of Crowds. So it was after the French Revolution, and he observed a lot of this. And his thinking was that the crowd has a unique psychology that's separate from the members. Okay, the crowd has a psychology of its own. He said it was impulsive, often not well informed, and would develop what we call groupthink, which is kind of what I've been talking about, right? So we want to be careful not to get pulled into the crowd. And the next slide is just a bunch of people storming a castle with pitchforks. The next slide is one slide I hope you can see at some point, because it's sort of a graph of kind of what our community goes through when there's a crisis. So I'm going to kind of walk through the phases. So the first phase is the pre. Sometimes we have a warning, sometimes like we know a hurricane's coming 3 days before, or we live in a country with a lot of earthquakes, or we have some warning. So that period of anxiousness and preparing. Sometimes we don't get very much warning at all, like now. Then we have the event, the impact. Of course, I think one thing that's really, really hard about this situation we're in now is the impact is ongoing. Even with 9/11, as bad as that was, on 9/12, the healing began, right? We started to rebuild. We started to fight back. But the event of 9/11 was really over in a few hours. Whereas this COVID thing, the event is ongoing. Sort of almost like more like a war or something, right? Because we're looking out weeks, possibly months. And so I think the impact phase is much more difficult for us right now. The next phase is what we call the heroic phase, or the honeymoon phase. And we're kind of in that now, I think. That's when people sort of make a real effort. They pull together, they share things, they let people sleep in their offices and bring food to each other and pull together. It's funny, a lot of my colleagues in the RMOP group wonder, should we go right after the event? And some of my colleagues think no, because that's when people actually are doing okay. Unfortunately, what follows the honeymoon phase is the disillusionment phase. And I feel like we're having a little of that already, which is when people sort of are getting exhausted and tired of living like this. Wanting to go outside, wanting to go to a basketball game, wanting to go have dinner at a restaurant, and getting frustrated with each other. And then the last phase, which is important, is what we call reconstruction, the new beginning, right? Remember? Endings, middle, new beginnings. And the thing about the graph that's important is it's plotted over a 1 year time. So these things take a while to play out. Even after they're over, they can take a while to play out. And then you can have sort of other events that are reminders of it that can set the community back. So you have a community that's sort of gradually healing after, say, an earthquake, and there's an earthquake in a neighboring country, and all of a sudden everybody's traumatized. So you go through this sort of, up and down phase as the community kind of recovers and gets back to baseline. So I think that's a really important kind of thing to think about, that we as a group, first of all, don't fall into the mind of the crowd. But second of all, have perspective that our group's going to sort of move through a series of phases. And right now we're sort of at the impact, heroic honeymoon phase. We're still feeling the impact. It's not over yet. And a lot of us are being heroic. But I also worry that we're slipping a little bit into the disillusionment phase too. And that's when we have to really be on our guard about things like the guilt and the blame and getting frustrated with each other. So the last side is the most important thing to remember, is emotional stress during times of change is normal, it's expected, and it's manageable. And I have my email on that slide too. But I think that's really one of the most important parts of this talk, whether I'm giving it, after an earthquake or in the middle of a virus situation. And that is that it's normal to feel irritable. It's normal to feel like you're not sleeping that well. It's normal to feel like you're distracted and can't concentrate, because it's a lot of brain energy back there processing these events and anticipating the next ones. And it's all behind that wall, so you can't really shut it off. That's that part of your brain that's sort of monitoring and thinking and avoiding and processing, because that part of your brain says, we don't want to go through this again. So even though your frontal lobe, your logical part of your brain says, well, thinking about this too much isn't good for me, that other part of your brain says, no, I want to think about this. I want to get prepared for it. I want to know what's happening. And so that's really hard for us, because we have other things to do, right? We have to figure out what we're going to do about work, what we're going to do about food, what we're going to do about our kids, all these things. And yet we've got this other part of our brain that's sort of an overdrive, processing and thinking and being afraid, no matter how logical we are. So be patient with yourselves. Recognize that this stressor is going to be with us for a while, unfortunately. Think about your routines. Think about the things in your life that haven't changed. Work on your self-relaxation, whether that's the breathing exercises, whether that's trying to do some exercise. And I know it's hard for me. I really like to go to the gym, and that's a big stress reducer for me, and I can't do it right now. So what I should do, right, is do push-ups in my living room and do sit-ups in my living room. And am I doing that? No. But I'm trying to get there. Partly I'm not doing it because I'm just frustrated. I don't want to do push-ups in my living room. I want to go to the gym. And foreign service people are used to that. It's like when you go to a new post and you just can't have that one thing you want. And even though there's other things that, are almost as good, you don't want those things. You want what you want. And I think we're all struggling with that right now. So try to take second place. Try to take the thing that helps, even if it's not exactly what you wanted. And sometimes it's pushing yourself over that first step that gets you to do it. So I really wish we could do questions. And hopefully, like I said, we'll do this talk live and we'll have time for questions and discussion. But I just wanted to get something out as soon as I could. I'll be back in Washington in about 8 days, and I'll be allowed to enter the building and use my equipment there. And so even if we can't get something together live between now and then, we'll have this. But I'm going to try and do something live as well. We're trying to figure out the platform that I can use. This is new for me anyway, and I think for a lot of us. So hopefully you've stayed and watched until the end. And you have my email on there. So if you have a question, you certainly can email me. But I'm hoping that we can get some kind of a live situation up soon. So thanks, everybody. Hang in there.